Hello, it's a pleasure to see you here for the active principal of the University of Trento. The word I will be speaking about today is Islam. So my research is about Islam, Islamic studies, and Islamic law. And I will explain today how Islam actually approaches the concept of pandemics, so not just COVID-19, but pandemics in general. So Islam and Islamic law actually regulate pandemics. If you go to the source of Islam, which is the Quran, the Holy Book, you will find verses of the Quran regulating health, diseases, pandemics. But if you look also at what the Prophet said and what the Prophet did, you will also have a lot of information about pandemics. So beside those two important sources of Islam, which is the Quran and the Prophet, we also know that there's a regulation of the burial of the body. So we found a lot of information about how you touch the body, maintaining dignity. We also have a lot of instructions and guidance about acts of worship. So you might remember that the COVID-19 unfolded during the Ramadan. And so a lot of questions were raised as to, well, what do we do? How do we celebrate Ramadan on a daily basis with the iftar at the end of the day? But also generally speaking, at the end of Ramadan, what do we do? Are we allowed to go to the mosque together? Are we allowed to eat together? There are also other aspects of interpretation that have been really important. So Islam has existed from the 17th century of our era and has evolved through the centuries thanks to interpretation. So we have basically provided interpretation all the time so that Islam remains alive, relevant, applicable to the modern era. And so that's what we've done with pandemics. We've interpreted it. And so today we are actually having a conversation about how Islamic finance can actually play a role in the COVID crisis. I explained, most, like all states around the world have been basically torn between, do we protect citizens and sacrifice the economy, or do we give the priority to the economy over the citizens? And so in Islam, we have given the priority to health, as I was explaining in a minute, as I will explain in a minute. But we do have possibilities now of like supporting the economy thanks to Islamic finance. Other conversation that have been going on around Islam and COVID-19 is, was it an opportunity or a threat for the different extremist groups that are so-called Muslim? And so how did they react to the pandemic? So let's begin first with Islamic law regulating pandemics. We know that there was a plague before the arrival of Islam, so in the 6th century. So that did not impact, obviously, Islam. But at the time of the revelation of the Quran by God through the Prophet via the Archangel Gabriel, we have leprosy. And so that is why we actually have direct references to diseases, health, and pandemics in the Holy Book, but also the Prophet addresses it. But then later, and that's why interpretations are really important, what happened is that in the 14th century, there's the big Black Death plague. And of course, Islam is going to have to adapt to this. So let's begin by the time of the Prophet. So let's focus on that period of time. We know that one of the purposes of Islam, we call that maqasid al-sharia. One of the purposes of Islam is to protect life. So the protection of life is inscribed at the very heart, at the very core of Islam. Life is a priority, which means that when the COVID-19 pandemic started, there was no question as to what Muslim government or Muslim groups or Muslim community had to do. They had to protect life. So as I said, there's been, of course, an evolution through the centuries. And what we have noticed is that the interpretation that have been provided, including at the 14th century when there was the proper plague striking the whole world, and part of the world that was discovered at that stage, of course, was that this idea of protection remains central to Islam. We find this in the Quran, so in the Holy Book, but also in the saying and the deeds of the Prophet. So if we focus a little bit, not just on the Quran, but also the interpretation, what we find is the concept of quarantine. So the Prophet has already established the idea of quarantine when you're ill and there's a pandemic. The idea of do not travel to a place where you know there is an epidemic. Also stay home, so we did not invent anything. It already existed at the time of the Prophet. But there were also more guidelines such as social distancing and do not touch each other and clean your hands. That already existed at the time of the Prophet. So we have specific examples, such as one by the Caliph Omar, who succeeded the Prophet and who was in a battle, and he was about to take his troop in a battle, and that was the first time really that Muslims, as they were expanding Islam, encountered the plague. And Caliph Omar was basically torn between two religious edicts. One that said, well, you have to go for jihad to expand Islam, and the other is you have to protect life. So as the head of the troops, he decided to back down. He basically said, I am not going to fight those troops because the plague is ravaging them and will contaminate us. He was, by the way, challenged by his military leader, who said, really? You are going to challenge a decree of Allah, a decree of God, which is that you have to expand Islam? And he said, yes, I will challenge a decree of Allah, because Islam tells me that I need to protect life. Unfortunately, his sacrifice of not going to war was not rewarded because the plague killed many Muslims later. Now let's fast forward a little bit to the modern era. What does that mean for state nowadays? Well, that means that they have an entire set of guidance when it comes to coping with the pandemics. They know they have to quarantine. They know we have to clean hands. Everything is already there. We have the guidance. This is where politics comes in. So when we look at the Islamic Republic of Iran, which is my main field of research, what we realize is the Iranian did not enforce a proper lockdown in violation of Islam. Why? Well, because there are heavy sanctions in Iran, and that because of those heavy sanctions, well, we could not put the economy under lockdown or the country would have collapsed. So this is interesting because it shows you that yes, you have religion, but you also have other factors that are going to impact your compliance with religion. Other example would include Egypt or Morocco, which are states where the authorities sometimes tend to lack legitimacy because they're non-democratic states. And so what had happened in those countries is when the pandemic struck, to be obeyed, when they said stay home, be quarantine, those countries, the authorities of those countries basically had to rely on Islamic institution. So that is interesting for us because that says that if you want the population to comply with the guidance in the Quran, you need the interference of the Islamic institution because the authorities themselves don't have a lack of legitimacy, basically. Another example would be the Gulf and Saudi Arabia, where Saudi Arabia was very quick to label the virus as the Shia virus because the virus came from Iran and the Iranians are Shia Muslims. And so here the idea was very much a political idea, which is look at our enemy propagating the virus. And then they used measure to basically oppress the Shia of Saudi Arabia. So this is really important to understand that there are guidelines that says protect life, be human, quarantine yourself, and then there are political factors that are going to come into play and that are important to consider. There is much more to talk about when it comes to Islam and the coronavirus, such as I said, Islamic finance, risk and opportunities for Islamic group. So if you want to know more, don't hesitate to contact me, and thank you very much for listening to me.